If you've had any cryptid encounters that you'd like me to share on here, email me at jttosstories@gmail.com. Story 1. So, this happened years ago, while I was still in high school. I'm now 23, and I've never shared this story anywhere, and only ever with a few select people in person. I live in Missouri, just north of Kansas City. One night, my buddy and I snuck out of my parents' house to go smoke. There was a trail that was right by my house and a local elementary school. Never really seen anything out there besides deer, foxes, coyote, etc. But growing up, we heard from parents and other families that the woods nearby were haunted. The area we lived in was right near an old slave farm, and I never gave it much thought. Being a kid who, yes, believes in Bigfoot, but has never seen any true proof, so I'm still pretty skeptical of the stories. Anyway, back to my story. After we snuck out, we made it to the trail. On one side of it, there were the backs of houses, and the other side, forest. As we were walking down the trail, it felt like any other time that we had done it. For the first 3/4 of the trail, everything was fine. But as we came up to the final bend, my friend slapped my arm and pointed into the woods and asked if I had just seen that. I looked into the woods and saw nothing, so I blew it off and thought he was just out of it. So I kept walking like everything was fine, while he still had his eyes glued to the woods. At the final stretch, about 50 yards, all canopied over, he slapped my arm and stopped me, this time with force. So I looked over, thinking it was still nothing. I saw a figure of something similar to a human shape, but standing about 8 feet tall. The reason I saw it was since the trees by it were shaking. At this point, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but I was still scared nonetheless. I said that we should keep moving, and we did, but now I too had my eyes glued on whatever it was in the woods. We picked up our pace to a speed walk, and after about 10 steps or so, the thing started to move as well, but on a path that would put it on the trail in front of us before the end. At that point, we looked at each other and immediately started running, like running as fast as we could. We made it to the end of the trail and immediately cut through someone's yard and into the street. Once there, I looked back towards the trail and saw that figure standing on the edge. After that, we went back to my home and talked about what just happened. Not sure what it was. I don't think it was a Bigfoot, but if it was a human, it had to be some 8-foot tall guy in the woods behind my neighborhood at 2 in the morning. Story 2. So I was a U.S. Marine from 2014 to 2019. I deployed to the Philippines to help out some joint operations against a certain terrorist organization. Basically, all we did was stare at the top of the jungle canopy, looking for heat signatures, and then communicating what we saw. So anyway, 3 months into deployment and 4 hours into this mission, I was staring at absolutely nothing. We were about 12,500 inches MSL at the time, over the mountains of Basilan. With really thick jungle canopy, even with infrared, stuff is hard to see. It was like trying to find needles in a haystack with Vaseline in your eyes. But when something's above the canopy, like a helicopter, birds, or monkeys in trees, it pops out, and you can get some really good definition depending on how good the camera operator is. A good trick to know if you have a hotshot camera guy is if they can fine-tune the infrared to see leaves in the canopy instead of just a big gray colored blob and atmospherics. I was the camera guy, and I was just chilling, staring into the void my pilot burned circles into the sky for hours. I asked my officer in charge of the flight if I could go smoke while the pilot took over the camera, after I lock onto a geopoint to keep the camera from going all over the place, and he said yes. So I go smoke, and not 1 minute later, I hear my boy inside flying go, dude, should get back in here and look at this. So I go back inside, all mad, as I hadn't gotten to finish my cigarette, but then I see what my pilot had locked the camera onto, I hop back into my seat and take control because I'm like, oh man, hotspot, is it cows? Is it terrorists? But it's not either of those things. It's flying just above the canopy at a pretty good clip, flapping and gliding on what I can only assume are very large pointed wings. At this point, it's just a very dark shape moving over the canopy till I clean up the infrared image and start picking out more. At first, I'm like, dude, it's just a really big bird. But then I see a rounded head at the front and a small space in between what I assumed was a tail that made me think they were legs. We are at 12,500 inches MSL, so detail wasn't amazing, but you can make out certain shapes. Like if I have a good day for atmospherics, light, and altitude, I can tell an RPG from an AK-47 if I'm lucky. Then my smart, college-educated officer is like, check out the measuring tool. Looks kind of big. We have a tool that uses geodata, altitude, and the aircraft's position, allowing you to use the laser and the program to let you know how long the distance is between 2 points. We mostly use it to measure buildings and various distances, but given we had the height of the canopy, I didn't see why it wouldn't work. So I take a screen cap of my cam and sent it to my pilot to work on while I'm still on lock. He does math and comes up with roughly 6 feet in length, head to toe, and a 17-foot wingspan. As I watched it fly, I kept thinking, that looks like a bat. Just the way it flapped and moved and the general shape. Not a bird. I couldn't pick up the feathers, and I didn't see a tail, really. Its wings definitely came out angular and stretched, like a bat's. The crew and I talked about it, passed it up to hires, but eventually we had to actually go do our jobs instead of becoming amateur zoologists. But after that flight, I just couldn't shake the feeling or place, what on earth was that? Fun fact, the tree right next to our smoke pit is absolutely filled with fruit bats. It glows in infrared. So my pilot and I got curious and started asking the local contractors who work the chow hall and the PX. A bunch of them laughed and told us it's because we stay up too late since we work the night shift. But a couple of the older ones told us about the tick-tick, like some kind of big old flying creature that eats babies. I was like, oh, that seems to check out. In an effort to disprove giant babe-eating man-bats, can someone please tell me what I saw so my spicy PTSD can just be regular PTSD? Story 3. This past summer, my husband and I were invited down to a friend's cabin in Kentucky, not far from Red River Gorge. We had so much fun during the week, going hiking and riding around the four-wheelers. Saturday was no different, and we had an awesome day out in the sun, with a nice dinner planned out that evening around the fire. We were setting up outside, and I was joking around with our friend about me believing in Sasquatches and how they like to tree knock. He humored me and found a 2x4 for me to knock against the trees. I excitedly knocked on the trees for a good bit until I was satisfied, but I didn't receive any knocks back. Soon, unfortunately, it started to rain, and I mean an absolute downpour that ended up knocking out the power. We got the generator running, lit some candles, and cracked some windows while dinner was cooking. Now, our friend had already told us that there were numerous Native American burial grounds on his property, and we were already in the midst of the ghost stories. Dinner was soon done, and we were all eating around the table when I heard what sounded like someone talking right outside the back door. I immediately stopped eating and turned to the back door and asked our friend, "What was that?" He smiled at me and told me I knew exactly what that was from the stories he had been telling us prior. I got up slowly from the table and headed to the back porch and sat down on the stool. I listened closely, and the forest seemed to come alive. Among the whippoorwill calls, there were voices, drums, music, and soon after there was whistling. Now, mind you, his nearest neighbor was over a mile away, and they were an elderly couple, so there was no way that they could be making all this noise. My husband and our friend soon followed outside as well, and our friend recommended knocking on the trees again. I followed his direction and began knocking as loudly as I could. Still, there was no knock back. So I walked back up to the porch and sat on my husband's lap listening to the music. The whistling continued, so we decided to humor it and whistle back the exact same way it had whistled. To our absolute nervous excitement, it began to whistle and pause, waiting for our whistle. We whistled back for a while, and our friend decided to hit the hay with his wife. Not long after, he decided to go inside. The whistling came to a stop, as well as the drums, music, and even the birds had gone silent. It was the eeriest feeling I'd ever had, and chills ran down my spine when far off in the distance we heard a loud single knock on a tree. I opened my mouth in disbelief when a dragging sound broke the silence again. The sound was something heavy, dragging what I thought were its feet through the leaves on the ground. It started off by the front gate where the knock had come from. It kept getting closer and closer, till it finally made its way to the gravel surrounding the cabin. My husband whispered under his breath and said, "What is that?" We shined our flashlight down the side of the cabin to only see nothing. My husband pushed me out of his lap, and as a last chance to try and see what the sound was coming from, he grabbed our friend's fleur to see if anything would come up on the thermal. We were frozen in fear, listening to this dragging noise approach where we were, and still we could see nothing. We were so scared we bolted inside, and I've never seen my husband that terrified as well as myself. Our commotion ended up waking our friend, and he came out of his room to ask what was wrong. We told him what had happened after we went inside, and we told him it was close to the side of the cabin. With the power still being out, we crept back to his room with the window still cracked, and we could easily still hear the dragging noise walking around the cabin. He built the cabin almost 20 years ago, and he had no words. My husband had no words, and I have never been so absolutely terrified, but yet excited in my life. The next morning, I walked out onto the back porch, and the only thing that stood out to me was a single large footprint in the gravel.